Can you believe that somewhere in the world, in the early 2000s, while people were already researching the possibility of living on other planets, there were still families who were so poor and hungry that they had to give away their children in exchange for just $100? Yes, this really happened, and I was that child. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about my childhood. I want to tell you this story so that you can understand just how poor and underdeveloped my hometown was in the early 2000s. I will tell this story only once, and I will never talk about it again because, to be honest, it is simply too painful and horrifying for me. My father was born in 1955, and my mother was born in 1963. They were born in a poor, mountainous rural area in northern Vietnam. Back when my parents got married, in 1982, they had absolutely nothing. They had no house, no money, not even a bicycle to get around. They walked everywhere, relying only on their own 2 feet. After my parents got married, my grandparents told them they had to live on their own and leave the family home. My grandfather didn't like my father. They often argued with each other over very small things. So my father took my mother and went looking for a place to live. The first home my parents ever built was on a piece of land near a cemetery. It was right next to a huge rice field. The place was far away from the residential area. There was a lot of abandoned land there, and no one seemed to own or manage it. My father bought some plastic tarps to protect them from the rain. Then, secretly, he built a small house with walls made of earth. The roof was made from plastic tarps and palm leaves. That little house was where all 6 of their children were born, including me. My parents had 6 children. My oldest sister was born in 1985, and I was the youngest. But there was something unusual. All 6 of us were girls. In Vietnam at that time, this was considered a very serious problem. Not because having 6 children was too many, but because my father didn't have a son. Back then, many Vietnamese families strongly hoped to have at least one son. They believed that when they grew old, their son would stay by their side, take care of them, and support them. They also believed that a son would carry on the family line and take responsibility for family traditions and ceremonies to honor their ancestors. Daughters, on the other hand, were expected to marry and leave their family. After getting married, they were often no longer involved in the important matters of their own family. They would return home when there was a family ceremony, or sometimes just to visit their parents. Instead, daughters were expected to devote most of their time and effort to taking care of and working for their husband's family. That was the reason my father kept having more children. He hoped that one day he would finally have a son, and I was his last hope. But sadly, I, the youngest child, was still a little girl. What a cruel twist of fate, right? It made my father very sad, and eventually he gave up because he realized that 6 children were simply too many. He couldn't afford to raise so many children. But the person who was truly angry about my arrival was my grandmother. My grandmother once planned to give me to a family who couldn't have children in exchange for $100. Back then, my family was extremely poor. 8 people in the family had to survive on the very little money my father earned. At that time, my father worked as a construction worker, and on the days when he couldn't find work, he would go to the river and catch fish for us to eat. My father could catch a lot of fish, with nothing more than a small tree branch and a few worms. My mother had to take care of 6 children, while also growing a little rice to help feed the family. Because of that, my sisters often had only 2 meals a day. For lunch and dinner, there was usually nothing more than a few roasted beans and vegetables that my mother grew herself. Sometimes, we would have a few chicken eggs for dinner, and if my father went fishing that day, the 6 of us would have fried fish for dinner. That felt like a feast to us. My grandmother often came to our house, and every time she visited, she would say, "This child should have been a boy. Because she is a girl, she has only made this family poorer. If she had been a boy, things would have been different. Even the gods didn't help our family, because this child was a girl." Looking back, those words were truly so backward and outdated. Every time my grandmother said things like that, my mother would cry, but my father would become furious. He would drive my grandmother out of the house and say, "Tui is my daughter, my daughter. Do you all hear me?" At that time, I had only been alive for a few months. My father loved me very much. As I grew up, I looked almost exactly like my father. I looked so much like him that whenever I went outside, even people who had never met me before could recognize that I was his daughter just by looking at me. Now, let's go back to when I was only a few months old. In the village where I lived at that time, there was a fisherman couple. They lived on a small fishing boat and spent their days traveling up and down the river, from early morning until late at night, catching fish. They didn't have a house. Everything they did, eating, sleeping, and living, happened on that little boat. They had no children. They were already around 50 years old, and they desperately wanted to have a child. They knew that my family was extremely poor, and that my parents already had too many children. So they came to our house and asked my parents to give them one of their children to raise. In return, they would give my parents 2 million Vietnamese dong, which was about $100 at the time. Back then, that was a very large amount of money. It could buy a lot of things. They wanted to do this because they dreamed of having a real family of their own. And they also wanted to help reduce the burden of feeding so many children in my family. But if my parents agreed, after taking the child, the couple would leave the village and move somewhere very far away. They wanted my parents to completely cut off contact with the child. They were afraid that when the child grew up, she might leave them and return to her biological parents. After hearing all of this, my father became furious. He took off the sandals he was wearing and threw them at the couple. Then he drove them out of our house, shouting angrily at them. My father said, "Even if I have to become a beggar, I will still raise my children. I don't want to lose a single one of them, especially Tui's the youngest little girl in our family." But somehow, this story reached my grandmother. A few days later, my grandmother went down to the river and spoke to the fishing couple. She lied to them. She told them that my father had changed his mind, but he didn't want to see the moment they took the baby away. So he had asked my grandmother to come and speak to them on his behalf. She told them, "Prepare the money and everything else. Tomorrow, when I call you, come to our house and take the baby." And of course, that baby was me, the little girl my grandmother never wanted. A few days later, the fishing couple had prepared everything. They came as my grandmother had instructed and gave her the $100. At that time, My father and mother had gone to the fields to work since early morning. My sisters had gone to school. The only person at home was my fifth oldest sister. She had been told to stay home and take care of me while my parents were working in the fields. She was only 4 years old at the time, and she was too young to understand what was happening. My grandmother came into the house and picked me up from the bed. Then she handed me to the fishing couple. She kept urging them, "Go now, hurry up." But just as they were carrying me out through the door, my father suddenly came home to pick up some things for work, and he discovered what was happening. My father was furious. A fight broke out between him and the fisherman. The fisherman injured his hand during the struggle. The fishing couple became terrified by my father's anger. They put me down on the ground and ran away. Now, only my grandmother was left there. She tried to explain that she had only done it to reduce the burden of feeding one more child and to get the family $100. She tried to calm my father's anger. She told him that the money could give him some capital to start making a living. She said it could change the future of the family and the lives of the children. But no matter what she said, all she received was my father's furious stare. He didn't say a word. He simply took her by the hand, pulled her out of the house, and locked the gate. Then he picked me up and put me back on the bed. From that day on, my father never left me in the care of my fifth oldest sister again. She was simply too young to look after me. Instead, my third oldest sister was responsible for taking care of me whenever my parents were away. My father also bought a very large padlock and a thick chain. Every time he went to work, he would wrap the chain around the gate and lock it. The gate would only be opened when he came home, and that was how my life began. The years that followed passed by quietly and peacefully. Even though life was still very difficult, our home was always filled with laughter. Around 2010, when I was 7 years old, my two oldest sisters got married and moved in with their husbands' families. At that time, only my parents and the 4 of us sisters were still living at home. Because our family had only daughters, many young men who lived nearby would come to our house in the evenings to court my sisters. They would wear their best clothes, comb their hair neatly, and often bring a few candies for us children to win our favor. Then they would come inside and sit down to talk with my father. What they really wanted was to make a good impression on him. In my village at that time, if my father liked a young man, we were expected to listen to him and marry the man he approved of. Back in my hometown, this was considered completely normal. All the girls were expected to listen to their fathers and trust the judgment of an older man, believing that a grown man would be able to judge whether the young men courting his daughters were good enough for them. But do you know what bothered me the most? There were simply too many men coming to court my sisters. On some evenings, there could be 5 or 6 men in our house at the same time, and they drank a lot of water. Every 30 minutes, my father would ask me to boil another pot of water for those young men to drink. Because I was the youngest girl, my sisters often made me do little chores like that. At that time, we had a rainwater tank at home, and because I was too lazy, I would simply scoop water straight from the tank and give it to them to drink. Looking back now, I realize I was actually a pretty terrible little girl, but it has also become one of the funny stories that my sisters and I often talk about. Honestly, Those were the memories of my childhood. I still remember when I had grown into a teenage girl, around 14 or 15 years old. By then, living at home, because there were fewer people in the family, our workload became heavier and heavier. Every morning, my parents would wake up at 5 a.m. They would cook breakfast, eat, and leave for work while my sister and I were still asleep. My sister and I would wake up at around 6 a.m. After breakfast, I would go to school. My sister, however, would work at a small grocery store until late at night. I only went to school in the mornings. In the afternoons, I was responsible for taking care of 3 cows. My father had bought these 3 cows 2 years earlier, when they were still very small. He said he would raise them until my 5th oldest sister got married. Then he would sell the cows and use the money to pay for her wedding. At that time, I was 15 years old, but I was probably only about 1.4 meters tall, and I looked very small. The 3 cows would walk around me, and honestly, they made me feel like a tiny little person. Every day at lunchtime, after eating, I would take the cows to a field far away from our village. It was about 4 kilometers from our home, and we walked there. The cows needed to eat grass, but all the grasslands near our house had already been eaten by other cows, so I had to walk a very long way, pulling these heavy cows along with me. Can you imagine a tiny little girl holding 3 ropes tied to the noses of 3 huge cows and trying to pull them along? Back then, I worked very hard, cutting grass to bring home for the cows to eat, because every day I had to take the cows out to graze and cut grass to bring back home. I became obsessed with grass. Even now, I have my own independent life, and my family is doing much better than we were back then. Whenever I pass by a large field covered in fresh, green grass, I still unconsciously say, "Wow, the grass here looks so good. I wish there had been this much grass back then for the cows to eat." All of those things have now become memories. They were difficult times, but honestly, they are beautiful memories to me. Now, I have become a mother with 2 little angels by my side. My marriage was not a happy one, but that is also a part of my past now. Today, I am a grown woman, and I am free. I can do the things I want to do. I still have a long future ahead of me. Everything is only just beginning. Right now, the only things I own are a motorbike and a computer. I use the motorbike to get around. And I originally bought the computer mainly so the kids could watch cartoons whenever I needed to work and couldn't look after them. I bought the motorbike more than a year ago from a second-hand shop, and believe it or not, when I bought it, the bike didn't even come with any paperwork. If one day I'm unlucky enough to be stopped by the traffic police and asked to show the motorcycle documents, I might actually lose my beloved motorbike. But luckily for me, I always follow the traffic laws, and I've never been stopped for a document check. The money I had saved when I left my husband's house has now run out. I needed some time to recover emotionally and rebuild my life. During that period, I wasn't working. It was honestly a very difficult time for me, but now I've found my strength again, and I'm slowly getting my life back on track. And it's all because of my 2 children. They are the reason I keep moving forward every day. And I'm so grateful that I discovered YouTube when I first started making videos. I only wanted to preserve the memories of my life. I thought those videos would stay there forever, and maybe one day my children would watch them and understand how brave their mother was and how hard she worked just to survive. And you know what? I've had the chance to talk to so many people from all around the world, something that, as a girl from the countryside, I never imagined would happen to me. Being able to share my story, to open my heart, to feel cared for, and to have friends who stay by my side and follow this journey as I try to change my life. That is the most wonderful thing I have ever experienced. Thank you all so much. I'm truly grateful that you are here with me. I hope that all of my friends, everyone who has been and continues to follow our journey, will have a happy life. I love you all.